Rust is one of those games that doesn't necessarily need an intro as to what it is. Everyone knows or has at least heard of Rust, but for those of you who don't know, Rust is an open world survival game where you play alongside and against other players in your server. You start with a rock and torch and progress through the game from there at your own pace. You'll build a base, get door counts, get lots of loot, die to a DB grab, do your first raid, and immediately get countered the second people hear that boom. You can kind of grasp what I'm getting at here. Rust is a vicious cycle of highs and lows, but it's the highs that make this game so addictive for many. I'm going to discuss and explain why Rust is the best survival game in the genre currently, and put it up against a few similar games that it frequently gets compared to. So with that said, let's begin. To start, let's understand what actually makes Rust good. Things in this game that make it shine, if you will. To list a few: frequent updates, plenty of content, proximity chat, freedom to play how you want, the graphics and art style, interactions with other players, and so much more. They're just the main ones that come to mind when I think of what makes Rust fun for me. And I know a lot of these points I mentioned are consistent through other rival games such as DayZ and Ark, but I feel like Rust does it best in some aspects, but more on that later. For now, I'm going to go through in detail the points I mentioned and explain why each little thing brings so much to the table, starting with frequent updates. Facepunch releases an update typically on the first Thursday of every month, and with these updates, there's always something new to try out or explore, whether it's a new monument, items, or mechanics for a certain transportation method. It's never disappointing, and they do a great job on keeping the game fresh for both new and old players. It goes to show how much Facepunch cares for their game, and can seem at times that they're hell-bent on giving players new things to do all the time. If you were to stop playing Rust right now and come back in a few months, I guarantee it might seem the same, but after a while you'll notice that the meta changes and people shift their playstyles to better suit the new environment that gets put in motion with these new items. And this is a good thing. Even if you dislike a certain change, you have to agree that the consistent positive throughout these updates is it slowly morphs the players to change their playstyle. So what does this achieve exactly? Well, it's simple: engagement. With the consistent content being thrown at us each month, it's easy to get lost in the rabbit hole of new things to do, and that is exactly what keeps players coming back. This all ties to my next point: the amount of content. Let's say, for example, you're new to Rust. It's your first time playing and you're not too sure what to do. Well, that depends on what you want to do. Make a farm with copious amounts of teas, food and cloth? Sure. Build a base as close as possible to a monument to control it for the wipe? No problem. Make your base into something straight out of Satisfactory? Absolutely. Really, there is so much to do in this game, you'll likely never find an end to it. I mean, obviously there is a limited amount of things to do, but once you start making a farm, for example, you'll explode with ideas on how to make it more efficient, or with visions on making it absolutely humongous. Whatever you think you can do, you more than likely can. I see so often this game being labeled as a PvP Chad game where you have to be amazing to compete, but the reality is that you really don't. Freedom of playstyle. When I first played Rust, I was under the impression that I had to get guns, and more guns, which are helpful of course, but as I played more and explored more servers, I realized that I can play how I want. If I'm feeling like I want a fast progression wipe, I can play a 2x modded server. If I want a more authentic wipe, I can play an official server. Or if I just want a server that I can play on normally and try out lots of crazy building ideas, I can play on a PvE server where there's no risk of dying to other players. A more recent example of this for me is a server known as Deadlock and Chill. It's a server where you can choose to be PvP or PvE. The community is great and it's one of the only servers I found that can run on Linux. That's probably just because I don't really look for that. It's currently the server I'm playing on, as I just want more relaxed wipes. So if you are interested in joining and becoming part of this community, feel free to join. I'll leave a link to it somehow in the description, but aside from that, my point is that no matter what your playstyle is, there's a server for you. And this is great. Why? Well, it appeals to anyone and everyone who has ever had the slightest interest in Rust. The graphics and environment. Moving away from how the game plays, and more just on how it's presented. There isn't a specific place on Earth that it's based on, but Rust is inside of a post-apocalyptic environment, with radiation being a common issue with a lot of the POIs that you'll come across. It's an abandoned but beautiful environment that changes every time with procedurally generated maps. For most servers. There was a more recent update known as the Worlds Update for Rust that changed the landscape and how it generates. There's now deep valleys, cooler caves, massive lakes, oases, Yep, that one. And a lot more. It added so much more depth to the game and made a lot of unique base spots available too. There's not much to say about the graphics other than they're not trying to be realistic in any way, but they fit the game really well. And for that, I love them. But one more thing to add here, as I don't see any other place where it's relevant, but the design of some items I find are so cool. I know it's very simple, but the AK having a shovel handle as the buttstock, for example, or the new handmade SMG having some wire for the iron sights, it's so unique and really builds upon the personality that Rust has as a game. Proximity chat. This is a very short segment, but I think it's worth mentioning. The voice chat in this game goes from people screaming in the mic, "Mysterious man, what is your name?" That's a great name. To having a civilized conversation.
Gimme!
No.
Gimme! Gimme!
No.
No.
To shit talking someone you know is countering your oil, but you just can't see them. Although proximity chat has become a more common feature in recent games, I believe Rust wouldn't be where it is without it, because you probably don't even realize how much of an impact it has on your gameplay. Whether you don't use it and just listen, or whether you are the guy that blasts their mic with Travis Scott music, just knowing each person in the game is there, present, and interacting with others has always been so cool to me. And in Rust, in unison with proxy chat, it goes together like peanut butter and jelly. Interactions with other players. Proxy chat is one part of interacting with other players, but there's also a marketplace where people sell their items for others to buy, which gives the game a sense of economy. The act of raiding someone's base they work so hard on creates a lot of tension on both sides of the raid. Being the first to board cargo and fending off the counterers is also just such an adrenaline rush in itself. The point I'm trying to make here goes back to the highs and lows I was talking about earlier. Only players can create these interactions. The game completely relies on each person doing their own thing until they cross paths with other players doing their own things and chaos commences. This is of course different if you're PvE, but for the majority of the player base, this is what makes Rust so fun and addictive. They were some of the reasons that I think makes Rust so amazing, but how do they compare to their rivals? Who are their rivals, and how do they stand out? Well, I'm going to discuss just that, starting with establishing who their rivals are. In more recent gaming, survival games have become one of the more beloved genres, and for good reason. There's just something about finding this primitive nature inside yourself and being prompted to think outside the box with difficult decisions that a lot of these games present. However, they vary a lot. You have The Forest, Minecraft, Subnautica, Ark, Conan Exiles, DayZ, Grounded, Valheim, Project Zomboid, Don't Starve, and just so many survival games that each have their own take on how to make one. And of course, none of these are the wrong way of making a survival game, but it's completely down to preference of the player to decide which one of these they like best. Now, to categorize Rust, I would put it in a more PvPvE area, where there's people to kill, but there's also threats in the environment such as scientists. This is of course compared to more co-op survival games such as Grounded, where you and your team work together against the threat that the game itself presents. So now that we know that Rust is a PvPvE game, what other games do this and are in the same category? Well, the most predominant ones that come to mind are DayZ and Ark. And this isn't just my opinion. I see this a lot with the community of these three games on TikTok or other short form content, arguing which is the best. Well, to settle the argument, it's Rust. No, I'm kidding. It's not as simple as that, as these games may be in the same category, but does that mean it's a fair comparison? Well, yeah. In some aspects it can be, such as how well a game performs can be compared to another, but other things, such as which has better PvP, is more of a grey area. Let me explain. So an individual can prefer something from a certain game compared to another. In this scenario, Bob likes DayZ more than Rust because of the PvP aspect, and that's completely fine. But does this mean that Rust has bad PvP mechanics? No, it doesn't. It just means Bob, as an individual, doesn't like Rust PvP, whereas John makes a point where he likes Rust PvP, but he doesn't like DayZ PvP. Once again, does this mean that DayZ is bad for their PvP? No, just John's opinion and no one else's. So where do I stand with the comparison of these three games? Well, I'm a big fan of DayZ, not so much Ark purely because I haven't played it as much, but I think that all three games do their own thing really well. If they didn't, they wouldn't have a dedicated player base. I prefer DayZ personally for more of a realistic survival experience, one that's more brutal and unforgiving. I prefer Rust for a more arcadey but still smooth and fun experience for a survival game, where more crazy things can happen that aren't necessarily realistic but still cool. And Ark, for me, is one of those games I'll go back to maybe once every 2 years with friends and we'll play against each other on a server. That's just why I love these games. But everyone has their own opinion on these games. Just ask Bob and John. Obviously, from the title of the video, I do have a preference though, that being Rust, as I find there's a lot more to do and I've become interwoven with the community, not just online, but in individual servers too, such as the Deadlock and Chill one I mentioned earlier. Overall, I do believe that Rust is one of, if not the absolute best survival game to date, and unless they add microtransactions like a certain company, my mind can't be changed, and it's as simple as that. And that's it. That's my outlook on Rust and what makes it such a good all-around game. I hope you enjoyed. My schedule's been all over the place on YouTube recently, and my uploads aren't as consistent, but I'm hoping to change that. I have a script all ready for Bully, so that should be the next video. But yeah, other than that, thanks for watching and goodbye.